But this man was one of the main reasons why black slaves in Great Britain were freed in 1833. This man's name was William Wilberforce, and he's a personal hero of mine. William Wilberforce was just 21 years old when he won a seat in Parliament in Great Britain. His first few years were spent enjoying the prestige he had gained and making friends with the upper class there. It wasn't until he converted to Christianity a few years later when Wilberforce began to fight for the abolition of the slave trade and also slavery as a whole. I'm going to insert a little note in there that's not in my sheets. When Wilberforce converted, he had this long journey into Italy and France. He came back into Great Britain and met a man named John Newton. For those of you guys that know that name, John Newton actually wrote the hymn Amazing Grace. There's a movie based on this as well. Wilberforce wanted to leave politics, and John Newton basically said, no, I think you could do some damage in there with your seat. And thus, Newton was able to convince Wilberforce, and one of the reasons why was slavery. John Newton was a captain of a slave trade ship, had written Amazing Grace after he basically figured out what he had been supporting as a captain of a slave trade ship. So, Wilberforce later wrote in his journal, God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and reformation of manners. From 1789 to 1805, Wilberforce introduced 12 resolutions against the slave trade, each of which were shot down in different ways, many being political. He had passed, I think a couple times, it passed the House of Commons, House of Lords that shot it down. Due to these actions, Wilberforce made himself a target for those who were prospering from the slave trade. He was attacked constantly in many different ways, but he never stopped. He continued to fight. He formed a group of abolitionists, and they basically began to try and convince not only politicians, but also the people in general of how evil the slave trade really was. They had brought in chains that these slaves were chained up in. They had showed how tight the quarters were on these ships when they were being shipped from Africa. Wilberforce continued to fight, and finally, he outmaneuvered his opposition. He himself did not run the resolution, but on March 25th of 1807, they had passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act with 267 votes in favor of the measure. When Wilberforce put his first resolution up, he got just 88 votes in favor of it. That was years of hard work to finally get that through. But of course, after abolishing the slave trade, Wilberforce was not done, and he turned his next target to getting rid of slavery as a whole in the land of Great Britain. Wilberforce joined the Society for Gradual Abolition and worked hard to change the public perception on the issue and also humanize the slaves. And I've got kind of an interesting little story. I did a lot of research on Wilberforce back when I took a master's degree class, and they had used promotional products, including one that was a coin. And this coin had a black African slave in chains, basically doing this, and it said, am I not a man? Am I not a brother? Basically wanted to humanize these slaves. My wife and I took a trip recently to the Bahamas, and we were driving through Nassau, downtown there, and I looked to my left, and I see this exact poster of this coin. It was very neat and very encouraging. They had obviously a very similar situation there in the Bahamas, too. Wilberforce continued his fight against slavery even after he left Parliament in 1824 due to health conditions, after serving for nearly 45 years in Parliament. Wilberforce did what he could afterwards, but his health was in serious decline. However, his efforts had changed the country as a whole, and on July 26th of 1833, Great Britain abolished slavery. Here's where it gets really interesting. Somebody gave Wilberforce that information on July 26th. 3 days later, William Wilberforce passed away. To me, I can't do it justice. Sometimes I tear up just thinking about the story. There's way more to it. I would encourage you to watch the movie Amazing Grace. It's very powerful. There's also some good books out there too. But I think this story shows how effective a politician can be in fighting evil and eventually winning in the end. He was a better man than I could ever hope to be, but I would really encourage you all to study him. And it's been an honor to be able to speak about him today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.